In 1956, the Eastern Bloc had been undergoing some changes. Three-decade dictator Stalin had passed away in 1953, and his successor, Khrushchev, had launched the Soviet Union into a strange new period. He was still an authoritarian and a staunch communist, convinced about the necessity of the US-Soviet Cold War. Yet, he was also reform-minded. He would denounce and tear down Stalin's cult of personality, thereby announcing a new direction for the Soviet Union with more room for freedom. Within the Eastern Bloc, this would swiftly be tested. In Poland, a staunch Stalinist had been in power, and upon learning of Khrushchev's de-Stalinization, protests erupted. Calls for the installation of Władysław Gomulka were widespread, and soon Moscow feared that they might lose control over Poland altogether. Yet, negotiations between Khrushchev and Gomulka would begin, in which a deal would be reached. Poland would remain loyal to Moscow, yet the government had secured more domestic independence. A great victory for the people of Poland. But Polish success would inspire others, mainly Hungary. Soon, hundreds of thousands took to the streets of Budapest, demanding things like free elections, an independent judiciary, and the removal of an absolutely massive statue of Stalin in Budapest. Before the end of the day, the statue had indeed fallen, and Soviet forces already in Hungary moved to the city. Attacks on government buildings collapsed the government as chaos engulfed the nation. The Soviets, discussing what to do, seriously considered pulling their forces from the nation and entering negotiations with the newly formed government of Imre Nagy, essentially hoping for a repeat of the Poland situation, allowing Hungary internal independence as long as they remained tied to Moscow. But arguably, one single statement ruined this hope. Nagy would not just ask for domestic independence. He would demand that Soviet forces leave the nation. But more importantly, he wanted to leave the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet Union's military answer to NATO. This was unacceptable to Soviet leadership. After faking a retreat, Soviet armies soon launched a full invasion, striking the Hungarian Revolution down with force. The Soviets chose János Kádár to build a new government, while Nagy was executed. Khrushchev's promises of more freedom had for now ran hollow for the people of Hungary. But what if the Hungarian Revolution was successful, implementing the demands of the revolutionaries? This, of course, is very difficult, especially if we go with the radical demand of Hungary leaving the Warsaw Pact. Even if Nagy had no intention to break with communism or do something like align with the West, it would still be seen by the Soviets as a weakening of their sphere of influence. Again, Khrushchev and the Soviet leadership had initially decided upon a retreat from Hungary until this demand was formalized. To give Hungary the best chance, we can change a number of things. First, Nagy must be more conciliatory to the Soviets, keeping his full intentions secret rather than announcing his intention to leave the pact via radio. During these crucial few days of chaos, Nagy had the great position of being trusted by the Hungarian revolutionaries while also being someone that the Soviets could negotiate with. He needs to make use of this fact. Another potential change is Mao Zedong. As the leader of the second most powerful communist state, he held quite a bit of weight. And initially, he expressed opposition to the intervention in Hungary. Later, he would change his mind and support the invasion instead. Let's have Mao continue to oppose this invasion. A final change we can make is the Suez Crisis. We don't need to go into much detail, but basically, while Egypt was now independent, France and Britain continued to hold influence over the Suez Canal, which Egypt had just nationalized. In response, France and Britain launched a very controversial military intervention. In terms of timeline, this was terrible for Hungary. In late October, the Polish uprisings happened. On the 23rd, the Hungarian Revolution begins. On the 30th, the Soviets decide not to depose Nagy's new government. On that same day, France and Britain demand that Egypt leave the Suez Canal and began bombing runs the next day. On the 1st of November, the Soviets decide to invade Hungary. While it is absolutely not the primary factor, many historians have argued that the Franco-British actions influenced Khrushchev's decisions. After all, if the West can invade a nation to impose their will, then why can't he? Besides, the Suez Crisis now overshadowed Hungary for the international community, leading to far less eyes and thus controversy on Soviet actions. Now, we don't need to prevent the Suez Crisis, but even pushing it back a week or letting the Hungarian Revolution happen sooner could give Hungary a far better shot at success. Now, are these changes enough to guarantee that Nog will be successful? In the long term, no. But in the short term, also no. Even if Nog was a master diplomat, Khrushchev wasn't the most consistent man, and Nog would still have to somehow convince him to allow Hungary to have free elections and retreat Soviet forces from the nation. And that is before Nog drops the bombshell of also wanting to leave the Warsaw Pact. I basically see two ways for Nog to succeed. The first is negotiating that Hungary will remain in the Warsaw Pact, but just not participate in its activities. This would be easier to diplomatically convince Khrushchev of accepting. Alternatively, after the negotiations are concluded and Soviet forces have already left the nation, then Hungary announces their departure from the pact. This is far more dangerous, but there is a chance that Khrushchev just takes the loss. I'm sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with all the latest releases, consider doing so. Thank you. Now, for the sakes of this scenario, we will go with the second option, as it is more in line with the demands of the revolution. This, however, is not the end of troubles. Khrushchev has only just become leader, and he was far from popular. He attempted to consolidate power in himself, causing unrest amongst the other elites, while his de-Stalinization efforts were quite unpopular, considering most of the elites had Stalin to thank for their position. In our timelines, 1957, an attempt would be made to remove Khrushchev from office. After Hungary's great success, opposition to Khrushchev would be even greater, while other Eastern Bloc nations might also try their luck at forcing reform, requiring even more Soviet interventions, or risk collapsing the Eastern Bloc even more. Khrushchev's potential removal, which we will discuss later in this video, will have the biggest consequences of this entire timeline. But for the sake of this independence process, Hungary has a special and very beneficial location. Imagine Europe divided between East and West. Yugoslavia and Austria were neutral nations. Now imagine the loss of any Eastern Bloc nation. Losing Bulgaria means losing a way to threaten NATO around the Bosphorus. If they lose Romania, they also lose Bulgaria. Losing either East Germany or Czechoslovakia loses the front line to NATO, while also risking German unification. Losing Poland means losing logistics to Eastern Germany. Any of these nations leaving the Warsaw Pact are a significant threat to the Soviets. Hungary, though, is different, only bordering neutral nations and not being the link to other Warsaw Pact states. As long as they don't actually abandon socialism, it is the only nation that the Soviets might afford to lose. Now, as Khrushchev faces criticism for his handling of Hungary, we have a number of major splits in the timeline. The first option is by far the simplest, but also probably the most likely. After Nog's surprise announcement of leaving the Warsaw Pact, Khrushchev invades anyway and replaces Nog's government. As Hungary would be seen as diplomatically dealing dishonestly, the Soviet intervention would be slightly less controversial, but beyond that, we're basically just returning to our own timeline. Option 2 is Khrushchev, while extremely angry, accepting Nog's decision. Hungary has left the Warsaw Pact. From here though, Hungarian independence is still tenuous. Hungary would get Finlandized. What is Finlandization? Well, the term, unsurprisingly, refers to Finland. During World War II, the Soviets did not annex Finland, nor tried to install a puppet regime. Finland would be allowed to keep their internal independence, but they were expected to give up a certain autonomy in foreign policy. In the case of Finland, they were expected to not criticize Soviet foreign policy, while they refused to join Western institutions like NATO or the European Union. Hungary would be expected to act in a similar way. Despite Hungarian independence, the West will still respect Soviet influence over the nation and be weary of pushing their relationship too far. Besides, with Yugoslavia and Austria being neutral, there is little to gain from a Hungarian ally regardless. All of this means that even now, the Soviets could at any point invade Hungary, and both great powers, as well as Hungary, will be very aware of this fact. Don't expect Hungary to start criticizing the Soviets or encouraging other nations to also break with the Warsaw Pact. Assuming that Khrushchev is not deposed, the Cold War on the whole is not fundamentally altered. But let's now zoom in and look at Hungary's political system. For the same reason that Hungary can't criticize the Soviets too much, they must also be careful not to move away too much from communism. This is something that Nog would be very clear and open about. This was not a revolution against communism, this had been a revolution against Stalinism. Nog had expressed support for a return to a democratic system, and we know exactly what form that would initially take. For a brief moment, a number of political parties functioned in a post-war Hungary. In 1947, a coalition ruled Hungary of 4 political parties, which were later forcefully united into a single party. In Nog's new Hungary, at least initially, it would be these 4 parties which would be legalized, and you might have already figured out that this was not a very expansive political spectrum. Some other parties may be added, but expect all of them to broadly align with socialism. Nog had no intention of opening the nation up for full Western democracy, and even if he had planned this, as always, this would likely have been a step too far for the Soviets. Beyond that, central control over the economy would be reduced, as a bigger focus would be placed on local communities, with local worker councils having popped up by the thousands during the revolution, which would be instrumental in rebuilding the new Hungarian regime. What we would come to see is an expanded version of our timeline's Hungary. Even despite the revolution failing in our timeline, János Kadar, who did come to power, did reform Hungary. Compared to the other Eastern Bloc nations, Hungary consistently ranked as the happiest nation, with relatively more freedoms than the others, and having the economy more focused on consumer and civilian goods. These aspects would be even more true now, while Hungary could also in a limited capacity trade with the West, while still being a part of the Soviet economic bloc. But for now, enough about Hungary, let's discuss the Soviet Union. We have so far assumed that Khrushchev remains in power, but again, there is no guarantee. The loss of Hungary would be blamed on him, and while I don't think it is likely, this could easily open up the door for the opposition to remove him. The reason I think it is unlikely though, is that Georgy Zhukov, and thereby the military, were on the side of Khrushchev, and he would physically use the military to fly Khrushchev supporters to the capital to prevent his removal. Still, again, the possibility is there, so let's discuss what might happen with Khrushchev removed. Initially, he would be replaced by Bulganin, but he is a largely uninteresting figure. Khrushchev's opposition was only united by a dislike of Khrushchev. Ideologically, they differed greatly. Bulganin was merely the compromise candidate nobody had a major issue with, but behind closed doors, a new struggle for power was only just unfolding. Many choices are available to come out on top, but the 2 I consider most likely are Malenkov and Molotov. It is also important to note that while I am focusing on these men, they likely wouldn't rule alone, and there is no guarantee they'd have the authority to actually push through all of their ideology. Now, option 1 is Malenkov. He had briefly succeeded Stalin before losing the power struggle to Khrushchev. He would be best situated to cooperate with Bulganin to steer the nation into a moderate, reformist path, not unlike the one that Khrushchev steered in our timeline, as Malenkov was only opposed to the man himself, not necessarily his politics. In terms of economy, Malenkov was a proponent of managerialism, with party control over industries, subsidies, and strict production targets and price controls. Beyond the economy though, he wanted to downsize the party, reducing the influence that the party has over ordinary people's lives. He was also in favor of moving the economy away from hard industry, more towards consumer goods that improved the lives of the population. He would also allow the continuation of small business independent from the state, a system that Khrushchev tore down in our timeline, allowing limited, independent craftsmen. Malenkov's real big change though comes in foreign policy. Assuming he gets his way, the Cold War could be changed beyond recognition. You might know that before 1955, Austria was still under foreign occupation. But then, a deal was signed that allowed for Austrian independence under the condition that the nation would become neutral between the West and the East. This way, any fear of a new Germany situation and a potential conflict spot were removed from the map. Seeing this success, Malenkov was a major proponent of achieving a similar deal for Germany. This might be very difficult to achieve, and the great powers have a lot to discuss, like potential opposition to the plan from the other European states, which fear a united Germany, the role of the economic union West Germany was in at the time, etc. Still, it is a possibility, and should it occur, it would have major effects on the Cold War. Now, rather than an Iron Curtain, a neutral curtain runs from Yugoslavia to Sweden, removing most of the European tension points between the major blocs. This would make relations between Western Europe and the East far more positive, with Germany being the crossroads of pan-European relations. The Cold War could detente much faster, as I doubt that Malenkov takes steps like sending nukes to Cuba. All in all, Malenkov would likely ensure a more peaceful world should he go through with his foreign policy. Now finally, Malenkov was a big proponent of Comecon, an economic partnership of communist states. He had hoped to reform the institution into something resembling the European Union, eventually steering the Eastern Bloc to closer integration. In this goal, every nation or region would become specialized in the production of a certain number of goods. For example, Central Russia would produce heavy machinery, Ukraine grain, Poland steel, etc. The idea would be that such centralization would make each industry more efficient rather than having each nation produce a little of everything. Despite Hungary having left the Warsaw Pact, they would likely still be a part of this organization, or they would at least be an associated state like Yugoslavia. Now I doubt that Malenkov can achieve a full unification of the Eastern Bloc, but the specialization idea is interesting. Short term, it could very much boost the economies of Eastern Europe. Long term though, we could see many issues arise. If one nation producing a key good has any issues, the economic ripple effect might be far greater, especially if a very important good is knocked out. As long as the system works, it would work decently well. But during an alternate Eastern Bloc collapse, assuming it still happens, the collapse of their economies will be felt even worse than in our timeline. So, those are some key changes with Malenkov as the leader. The other option is Molotov. He had been a close associate to Stalin, and amongst the candidates was decently Stalinist. His coming to power would see a number of Khrushchev's limited reforms reversed, but many hadn't even passed yet, so he wouldn't need to change too much. Molotov's foreign policy is more important. He would attempt to keep the Sino-Soviet relation far stronger, potentially preventing the harsh split in relations of our timeline, which America would make use of to divide the communist world against itself. In this, Molotov is not guaranteed to succeed. The split ran deeper than just Mao not liking Khrushchev. The two nations fundamentally looked differently at the relationship. The Soviet Union saw itself as the dominant partner, at least for now, until China properly developed itself. This process is where tensions rose. Well-meaning Soviet advisors in China found major opposition, as they were accused of insulting and denigrating the Chinese they were attempting to help. From China's perspective, it is very understandable. They had just emerged from their century of humiliation, where many nations, very much including Russia, had made use of their weakness. Now, China wanted to be respected as an equal communist state, not subservient to Moscow. Whether Molotov would successfully navigate these feelings, I simply cannot tell. Now, unlike Malenkov, Molotov could very well invade Hungary whenever he got a chance. This would mainly depend on how fast Khrushchev got removed. If within weeks, Hungary definitely gets invaded. If it takes months, Molotov II might come to accept the situation, as long as Hungary doesn't mess up too much. Molotov might become dangerous during the Cuban Missile Crisis, as he would be far less in favor of backing down. This can have two outcomes: a harsher confrontation, and perhaps even World War III would be on the table should the leaders not be able to figure it out. Alternatively, Molotov would likely still try to resolve the situation peacefully, but he would make sure that the compromise was publicly known, rather than in our timeline, where the way it played out made it seem like the Soviets simply backed down, despite both nations making concessions. Molotov's Soviet Union might prevent a number of mistakes that Khrushchev made, like that time he tried to plant corn everywhere and it all perished. Like Malenkov, he was also in favor of allowing limited private enterprise, which is pretty much always recognized as an economic positive for the Soviet Union. The most important aspect of a Molotov leadership, however, would be his legacy. He would leave behind a more conservative, more controlling Soviet Union, and whoever comes to succeed him, which I cannot predict, will likely continue this trend. With all of this said, let's get back to the timeline where Khrushchev was never deposed, as it is the closest to our timeline, and assume that around a similar time frame, the Eastern Bloc crumbles in much the same way, and before long, Eastern Europe looks totally different. In this environment, depending on how Hungary's democracy and economy developed, Hungary may be a very unique case in Europe. Amongst others, in the Americas, Cuba survived the fall of communism, while in Asia, nations like China and North Korea did. In Europe though, all communist regimes would collapse. For many, Soviet domination and political oppression was a major reason for this, while in nations like the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, nationalistic desires also played a role. Hungary, again, depending on how they developed, might have neither issue. The fall of the East will definitely still be felt, but their relation with the West was already established. Their economy does not suffer as much as other states do. Their government was already a limited democracy, and rather than collapse the whole system, it might simply be demanded it is opened up to all political ideologies. This would be interesting. When Western institutions like the EU and NATO move east, would a leftist but democratic Hungary be welcomed now that the Cold War is over, or do old wounds heal slow? And are they kept out, at least until they broaden their democracy and liberalize the economy? Either way, both of these outcomes would have radical consequences for Hungary, and with it, Europe. For now though, this is the end of the video. Thank you all for watching, and consider leaving a like and a comment, as well as subscribing. If you've enjoyed this video, click the video on top to watch another in this series. If you've already seen it, then I'm sure that the bottom video is great too. Once again, thank you all for watching, and goodbye.